Yes.
Mr. Lister, I'm going to take you to your Beneficiaries Communication and Engagement paper from September 2011. It's CA...
Could I interrupt briefly? Would it be all right if I just reflected back on one of your earlier questions?
Of course.
Before we move on. Apologies for interrupting you.
Of course.
But I didn't want to forget myself. You asked why it had taken until February of 2013 to have a discussion with the board about having a beneficiary trustee.
Yes.
And I've been thinking about that in the break. I think part of the reason involves sort of an explanation of what had been going on in Caxton in the previous year. You may want to come on to that anyway, but the fact that as well as trying to get the National Welfare Committee operating in a good way, dealing with issues around throughput of applications and speed of response to beneficiaries, which was pretty poor in some places to begin with, the fact that our Chief Executive Martin Harvey was becoming increasingly ill and decided to leave partway through the year, so we had a need then to recruit an interim and then a full-time chief executive. We also needed to find a new chair. There was, I recall, a decision that we would recruit to those new posts and we would recruit additional trustees, and then the last thing, rightly or wrongly, that we would do is look at a beneficiary trustee, someone who could at least provide some of the experience and for the board that we lost when Charles Daw left. So that's part of, I think, a big part of the explanation about why it happened at this point and not sooner, if that helps at all.
So if we look now at your paper on beneficiaries, communication and engagement, CAXT 40108_045. So this is a paper, we can see at the top it's 11, but if we go to the 30.11, if we go to the second page, at the bottom, your name with September 2011. So if we go back to the first page.
And just before then, this is, I think I referred to the fact that on the 16th of August, I'd had an email exchange with Martin Harvey because he'd circulated the agenda for that board meeting. And I said, the communication with beneficiaries wasn't on it. So I said, I think we do need early decisions on how the board will engage with the beneficiary community, and suggested that we have this on the agenda. And then I wrote this sort of brief paper to try and get a discussion going.
And the purpose is to seek members' views on the most appropriate vehicle for the board to use to engage with beneficiaries. And then the recommendation, paragraph 3, is that the board take a view on how it wishes to communicate with beneficiaries. And then you set out in the background why it's important that there is this communication. And then if we go over the page, you set out the different options as you see them. And you suggest that there's that one of the options is a forum, and you set out the pros and cons. Open sessions in board meetings is another of the option, and again you set out the pros and cons. And then the third option you identify as a newsletter stroke content on website, and again you set out the pros and cons. Can you just help us with what content on website means?
I'm assuming that what I was meaning was, well, it could have meant either just the provision of information, which you think is what I was probably talking about. I guess it could have referred to something more like having a forum, but I'm not sure I had thought that far at this stage. I mean, looking at this again, this is a very tentative paper of mine. I was very new on the board, second meeting, and I think in future, my papers, they tend to have more of a recommendation. I was leaving this rather open. There was certainly no appetite at the board for having open sessions at the board meeting. I think that the feeling was that that would be difficult to organise, given that a lot of the content would be about specific cases, etc. I think that was the argument. Although I did suggest that there would be perhaps a way of managing that. I think I'd seen other examples where boards of organisations would have a public part of the meeting and then a closed part of the meeting, and manage their business that way. But there was no appetite at all for that. So the only things of interest, I think, were the idea of having a forum, which of course we didn't have. We didn't set up the partnership group until the first meeting of June 2013, so a long time after this. And the first newsletter was not until even later in 2014.
So you're there suggesting your conclusion at the bottom of that page says a newsletter stroke website content is the minimum needed. And presumably you take that view because the cons of that is that it doesn't allow for any direct interaction with the board. Is that right?
Yes, I think I was being concerned. I think I used the expression which was sort of picked up on my written evidence about the board not wanting to be a kind of ivory tower kind of body, that it needed to be accessible and willing to listen.
And so, and then you say views are sought on other options or alternatives that enable two-way communication. This paper gives the impression that your view is, well, the starting position is a newsletter stroke website, and then what else are we going to do that allows two-way communication? Would that be a fair reading of that?
Yes, indeed. I think that's a good way of reading it, yes.
So, as you've identified, we've got no user trustee on the board until for some time. We've got no partnership.
Well, we don't ever exactly have a user trustee.
Thank you. Yes, you're quite right. No trustee with lived experience of hepatitis C.
Well, I mean, we had at this stage Charles Gore on the board, of course, but we had a period after Charles left and before Margaret arrived, when must have been about a year, when we didn't have anyone.
And no partnership group meeting till 2013.
Indeed.
No newsletter, I understand, until December 2014. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. That's correct.
No forum on the website at all during your time at Caxton. Is that also correct?
That's correct as well. I think there was a concern about having the staff resource to moderate that. From recollection.
Why was that, given that you in September 2011 are saying, assuming this is going to happen in some form or another, that really very little happens for quite some time? Why is that?
It's a very good question. I mean, you will find going through the board papers that this issue of communication with beneficiaries comes back constantly. So, for example, I think in March of 2012, the minutes of the National Welfare Committee on the 15th of March record, this was the first one I chaired, I sort of brought up the issue of having an event for beneficiaries, and there was an agreement that a notice would be put on the website asking for input from beneficiaries, but it does not seem to have happened. So it was something that trustees pushed for, to have better communication, but it kept going down the priority list, to be honest.
And so are you identifying there a problem with the staff, for whatever reason, actioning?
I think it's I wouldn't want to just put this on the staff, because I think this was something for the, if things weren't happening, then it's the job of the trustee board to ask why not and to continue pushing. So I think it is a factor of a lot going on with a very, very new organisation, and maybe the focus not always on the right priorities. And managing, I mean, I think there's an issue, and for example, we were very, very poor in our turnaround time on grant applications in the first few months, and so we had difficulty getting even the basics right to begin with. Doing extra things on top of that seemed to be too much of an ask in many ways. There was can I mention as well, I kept bringing this back. I mean, it wasn't until sometime later, but in February 13, same board meeting where we discussed that paper on beneficiary trustee, I took a paper on issues raised by beneficiaries, and again tried to sort of address some of the criticisms and some of the ways in which we could reach out better. It's not actually authored, the authorship isn't on the paper, but I recognise it as one that I wrote. It's CAXT 40109 _115.
If you just give me a moment, I'll just CAXT 4 zeros 1 2 3 4 1. Sorry, 4 zeros.
109 _115.
109 _115.
So I think this was at the stage where after the contaminated blood campaign and others had met Anna Soubry and had made their criticisms of Caxton, which we were aware of. We hadn't yet had an opportunity to meet the minister ourselves, but I took the opportunity to try and set out what I thought were the criticisms that were being levelled at Caxton and what we should do about them. I think at paragraph 7, further down, I say these criticisms will be familiar to longer-serving members of the board. This was taking the opportunity for to get a number of the trustees, new trustees, and the new chair up to speed with some of this. And there's always a risk that this familiarity will lead us to not take these complaints sufficiently seriously. I think this was a concern I had, that, I don't know, sometimes organisations just sort of think, oh, well, yes, they will complain, won't they? And don't necessarily take a serious enough approach. So on the next 2 pages, I just go through the key criticisms and some suggestions about what we should do.
So if we go to the second page, please, Shemik.
Yeah.
So this is, you're talking here about the table that's provided.
The table, yeah.
And down the left-hand side, you've got issues raised with the minister, and on the right-hand side, you've got comment. And do we understand that the issues raised with the minister are the criticisms that have been raised about Caxton with Anna Soubry?
Yes, indeed. So this was around staffing levels and how long it takes to process grants, the length of Caxton's forms and their complexity, the burden of justifying charitable need, which was one thing we couldn't do much about, and the application of the sort of poverty, and managing read across, and yes, not having a beneficiary on the board. So again, these were all things that ideally we should have been having, I raised with the board, but ideally we should by then have been having an active dialogue with beneficiaries about this, I think.
Was one of the consequences of this failure to have formal channels of communication with the beneficiary population or community? Shomit, you can take that down. All the policies and principles and indeed strategies of the Caxton Foundation were set without any consultation from the beneficiary community.
Yes, that's correct. I mean, there's always a question in these circumstances about how much consultation it's reasonable to do, because the board of Caxton was responsible for setting its policies and working out how to best meet the needs of beneficiaries, and sometimes those are certainly decisions that we took very much on a case-by-case basis. It wasn't as if we had a sort of a policy review at one point with a series of recommendations. There were changes and new principles adopted as we learnt more about the needs of beneficiaries. But there was a point, I think, by this stage. So, for example, there was a paper I wrote for the board in May 2012 about addressing beneficiary debt.
Yes.
Which looks at the various different types of debt and our approaches to those. Arguably, that is the kind of paper that if we'd got our act together, we might well have discussed with beneficiaries, because there's nothing in there that gives anything away about individuals. It just sort of focuses on what is a reasonable approach to take.
I'm going to ask you some questions about debt in due course, and I can certainly take you to that paper then if you would like me to.
Yes, that would be helpful, thank you. So yes, in conclusion, I think we could have been having, or should have been having, much more active dialogue. I mean, for my own part, I have to confess that, throughout that sort of period of 2012, I was very much absorbed in making the whole grant application process more effective, and then in dealing with the consequences of the chief executive leaving, finding a replacement and finding a replacement chair as well, and also beginning to look at the beginning of a regular payment scheme. So I'm arguing, I suppose, that I was really busy during that period, which I was, but that's not necessarily an excuse for not really picking up on the fact that we should have been doing more in reaching out to our beneficiaries.
And can you help us with this? When Mrs. Lloyd was giving evidence, she thought, but she wasn't sure, I think it was the position she ended up in, that there had been an event, a beneficiary event, during the time that she was at Caxton.
There wasn't.
Again, do you understand why that was?
We had talked about having events, and you'll see that there's sort of references to things that might be planned. In the end, I can't remember when exactly. I'd have to refer to my notes. I think it might have actually been as late as 2014. We did a survey of our beneficiaries finally to ask what they wanted, and one of the things we asked them about was whether they wanted regional meetings, for example, and there wasn't much enthusiasm for them. So unlike with the Macfarlane Trust, where they had lots of sort of get-togethers of one kind or another with beneficiaries, sometimes over weekends, sometimes in circumstances, we didn't do that. And we didn't do that partly because we just didn't. with the new arrangement with one chief executive and a very small staff servicing all 5 AHO bodies, there was just not the resource to do that. And as I say, I think my priority immediately was, we need to speed up on our grant application process. That was the thing that I really was focusing on in 2012, because that was entirely unfair to the beneficiaries who had applied, that some of them had to wait far too long to get a response.
Can I ask you now about the reserves policy? Can we go to a minute of the meeting of the Audit Committee on the 19th of July 2012, which is CAXT 5065_062. So we can see that you're in attendance. You're present at the meeting. And if we turn over to page 2, right at the bottom, the last line there, the Chief Executive reported the DH's view on whether or not, and then over the page, the Caxton Foundation should maintain a retained reserve fund. He went on to say that the DH were advocating that each charitable entity and Alliance House should not maintain a reserve fund and should maintain an operational balance in the event there was an interruption to the funding applicable to each body. The committee noted that the Charity Commission require a charity to have a reserves policy, even if there are no retained reserves. The committee noted that funding to the Foundation and other Alliance House entities is a commitment, negating the need to maintain retained reserves. Mr. Lister agreed to prepare a form of words in respect to the reserves policy in time for the next board meeting, scheduled on the 2nd of August. Now, I can't find reference to that in the board meeting of the 2nd of August, and I confess I haven't chased that through. But is it right to understand that this was the forum at which recommendations on reserves policy would have been made to the board? It would have been the audit committee that was doing that.
That would have been. It should have been the audit committee, absolutely.
And that, as a matter of fact, that was the reserves policy that the Caxton Foundation settled on.
Well, essentially, that we did not have a reserve.
Yes. Is it right to? It looks from reading this minute, and I appreciate it's only a minute, that there really wasn't very much discussion about it. It was simply, well, this is what the Department of Health want, this is what the Charity Commission require, we will go along with what the Department of Health want. Is that a fair reading of that minute? Is that what happened?
A bit long ago for me to remember this particular discussion, I have to confess. I think this is in the context, I'm sure, of, and forgive a little speculation on my part, the fact that the Department of Health was unhappy at the level of reserves held by the McFarlane Trust and did not want Caxton building up reserves in the same way. And there was a lot of discussion about how McFarlane were going to use those reserves, if I remember rightly. So, as Department of Health was the sole funder, we would have had to have reached agreement with them if we would have on any reserves policy, because that would have meant drawing down enough money for a reserve. So if the Department of Health said, well, we don't want you to have a reserve, I think we would have probably pretty much accepted that.
Can I suggest two consequences to you of the policy, the reserves policy that was adopted by the Caxton Foundation, and see whether you agree with them or whether you have any comment to make? It meant, first of all, that any underspend was lost to the Caxton Foundation because it was simply retained by the Department of Health.
Yes, I mean, we were working on, that public sector notion of annuality, that if we don't spend the money in year, it goes back to the department, or well, it never gets drawn down. Effectively, we don't get to use it. I think that might have been the case even if we hadn't had a reserve policy. I mean, if we'd have had a reserve policy, would normally mean that you would have enough money for a normal charity. It would mean you have enough money in the bank to ensure that if you have to close the charity, for example, you can pay your staff and you can see to your liabilities, etc. And a lot of charities will have, say, 4 months running costs, or maybe even 6 months running costs put into reserves. In our case, you could argue that because we were going to be wholly funded by the department with a sum of money every year, there was no need to have a reserves policy, because any plan to run down Caxton would have to be managed alongside the Department of Health and the right level of funding provided. But on top of that, we've got this business that happens a lot with government funding, that government provides funding for something to an external organisation, and if it's not spent, there is no facility to, generally on public spending rules, to hang on to that money for the following year. And we were caught by that. So I would say that that's a slightly separate thing from reserves, and sort of tied up with the way generally that sort of public spending rules operate.
So we've heard evidence from witnesses that were concerned with the McFarlane Trust, and I think it's the inquiry's current understanding that the Department of Health treated their pot of money slightly differently. They were given, it seems, their money, and they were able to invest it, hence they were able to build up such significant reserves. Was that, do you recall, ever a conversation that the Caxton Foundation had with the Department of Health?
I mean, I think to start with, the McFarlane Trust was given a sum, I mean, right at the start, was given a sum of money of something like 10 million. And it was some years later then before there were additional sums of money added to that. By that stage, they had built up some reserves in investment, and then the department provided top-up funding and allowed them to keep those reserves that they built up in the early days. So I think it was quite different in that sense, because where we started off with potentially 1 year's funding, McFarlane started off with a much larger sum intended to last for a longer period.
And is there anything that Caxton could have done about that? Could have made representations to the Department of Health to say we want to be treated in the same way that McFarlane are, so we want control over our allocation to spend as we want. If we don't spend it all in year one, we want to roll it over and be able to spend it in year two.
Yeah, I guess we could have done. I mean, I wasn't party to any of the discussions that the founding trustees had with the department during the setup of Caxton, so I don't know whether that was discussed at all.
But it certainly wasn't discussed during your time on the audit committee, for example.
No, not at all. We the point that I became a trustee, we had a funding arrangement that had been agreed and was not challenged after that.
And then the second consequence, I wonder if you would, what you would say to this, that in your witness statement you say on several occasions that one of the difficulties that the Caxton Foundation faced was the uncertainty over the annual allocation.
Yes.
And that one of the consequences of that was that it became difficult to make long-term plans for Caxton, because there was a concern that if one set up disbursement policies to give, for example, regular payments, and then the following year that money was halved or it wasn't there, then the beneficiaries would be in a very sticky situation, having being reliant on that money coming in. Is that right to understand your evidence in that way?
That's certainly true. So in 2014-15, when we finally were able to roll out the regular payment scheme. In that same year, the department was giving us messages about how the allocation for 2015-16 could possibly be reduced. And yes, certainly we were forced to say to recipients of, well, it wasn't a regular payment at that stage. The first one was a one-off payment, but we were obliged to say, please don't rely on this every year. I mean, that was always one of the concerns. I'm sure you'll get onto this issue of dependency, but that was always one of the concerns about a regular payment scheme, I think, in the first place, that understandably, if people have got an income coming in, they will adjust to it. They will adjust their spending in the light of that. And if there is uncertainty about future funding, that's a problem.
And so one of the and so I said I was going to ask you about the second consequence of not having a reserve policy, and is it this, that difficulty, that uncertainty is compounded by the fact that you don't have any reserves to guard against that cut in funds?
Yeah, I suppose it depends really what you want a reserves policy for. I mean, the Charity Commission's expectation, as I say, is that charities have a reserves policy to ensure that should the worst come to the worst and they have to cease operating, that they're able to meet all their liabilities. In this case, we're talking about something different. We're talking about building up a reserve that enables us to guarantee a level of income for beneficiaries year on year. So that would have required more than just the usual 4 or 6 months running costs. It would have required something much more substantial. And I think one of the department's issues, and particularly in that sort of period of public spending austerity, was that it didn't like the idea of public money sitting around in a bank account somewhere, not being spent, when it could be spent on frontline NHS services or whatever.
So I'm going to move on to a new topic. I'm conscious that it's nearly 4:30, so I wonder if now is a good time to break.
Well, how long is this new topic going to detain us, roughly?
I would have thought 20 minutes to half an hour.
Yes, very well. In that case, what we'll do is we'll take a break now and come back tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. And I think we can probably guarantee you a 10 o'clock start. But, so look forward to seeing you then. And 10 o'clock for everyone else, 10 o'clock.
Okay, thank you.